I'm a professor in ocean sciences at UC Santa Cruz. Like was mentioned, I've also co-founded the California Ocean Alliance, which is a local nonprofit that's focused on marine conservation and education. And what I want to talk tonight about is how we use whales to consider and represent healthy oceans and the technology that we use to study and conserve those. And my email address is down there in the bottom left. And if anybody has any questions that don't get answered or any other reason to chat with me, by all means, please reach out. Obviously, the work that gets done on cetaceans, as you guys know, in ocean conservation in general, takes a mighty, mighty village. And the research that I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight has supported over 100 undergraduate and graduate students, as well as postdocs, and has been funded by a variety of organizations, largely by the National Science Foundation, but the International Whaling Commission, the World Wildlife Fund, as well as places like the Office of Naval Research, National Geographic Foundation, so on and so forth. And I think what this illustrates is that when we do this kind of conservation work, we need support from a number of different sectors, those that support basic science, those that support applied research, and those that help to promote sort of the broader impacts or the context around promoting conservation from science. And so I'm really glad that we have these partners that span that spectrum of ideas and ideals. So the way that we study their underwater movement is by using technology of biologgers. The tag that's down here on the bottom left, we've worked with a company in Australia to develop over the past 10 or so years. These tags are non-invasive. They stick to the animal for 1 or 2 days at a time with suction cups. And the tags measure time, depth, and temperature, as well as measuring the acceleration of the animals in 3 axes. So the pitch of the animal up and down, the roll over to one side, or the heading change in a compass direction. As well, they have magnetometers and gyroscopes that allow us to help reconstruct the motion path of the animal in a 3-dimensional environment. The sensors sample at up to 400 times a second, which is very, very fast, which allows us to see in very good detail the kinematics or the motion of these animals underwater. These tags also record audio, so we can hear the sounds that the animals are making, as well as the sounds that they're receiving. And these tags also collect video, so we can see from the animal's perspective, what's the environment like, and what is the context around some of the behaviors that we see in the tag record. The tag then also is able to georeference itself with a GPS and has a VHF transmitter so that when the tag falls off, it falls off, floats to the surface. This little antenna sticks up. We go out and pick up the tag and download all of the data from the tag. We can then recharge the battery and put this out again. So this gives us a very good fine detail look at a day in the life of a whale. And if we put these on a number of animals and a number of species and in a bunch of locations, we can start to say some things about how animals behave. So here's how we do the business part, which is the real fun part. This is putting a tag on an Antarctic minke whale on the Antarctic Peninsula. The tag sits on a little cradle at the end of about a 20-foot carbon fiber pole. I stand in the front of the pulpit of this small boat. We try and get near the whale. Hopefully it wants to volunteer to be part of our study. And you just slap the tag on the back of the whale. Nice thing about these tags is they really don't affect the behavior of the animal. So the animals are doing what they naturally would do once the tag is deployed on them. Here's putting the tag on a blue whale off of Santa Barbara. I've now got a camera on a helmet of mine. This blue whale has just come up from a long, deep dive, so it's taking a number of breaths at the surface to regain its oxygen stores. We're approaching the animal very, very slowly from an angle so that we don't go over the flukes. And then once we get close enough that it looks like we're going to get an opportunity, you'll see that we accelerate up and put the tag right on its back. So the next time the animal surfaces, we'll probably accelerate. There we go. There's the acceleration. There's the tag going on. There's this beautiful image of this massive blue whale. Again, the largest animals on the planet. It's an absolute privilege to be able to work with these animals and get up this close to them. You can barely see the tag on the animal when it surfaces, just to get an idea about scale and how big these whales are relative to the instruments that we're putting on them. Now, one of the things that's great when we get the tags on the animals, they turn into cinematographers for us. So in this case, We're on the back of a humpback whale in a super group of 200 whales off the coast of South Africa. You can see all the krill in the water column that's clearing up, or that's kind of looks like snow there. And you saw that humpback whale take that massive gulp of food right in front of us. We see things like sea lions as well. So we get an idea about who is in the environment around the animals. This is one from closer to home. This is a humpback whale in Monterey Bay. This is one of my favorite little video clips going through this beautiful kind of asteroid field of sea nettles. And it gives us, again, this perspective of why animals are doing certain things if we can see from their perspective what the environment is like. And in this case, there's this group of hundreds of California sea lions that are foraging in the same area as these humpback whales. So some of the things that the animal does are going to be affected by things around it, like the presence of these seals and the presence of other animals. And it just gives us a greater view and a greater appreciation for what it looks like to be a whale in this environment. Another thing we can do is to take the track of the animal and put it into a three-dimensional space and look and see how the animals use the volume of water that they're in. So what this ribbon shows you is the actual orientation of a humpback whale. So as the ribbon turns, that is actually the animal turning onto its side. The blue and the red triangles that you see are when the whale is actively using its flukes. The yellow is just when the animal rolls over onto its side. But what this allows you to do is, rather than seeing on a flat, two-dimensional plane, how does the animal navigate through an environment? In this case, it's finding a patch of krill, it's accelerating through it, and then it's turning around and going back through it as well. And so what's great is you can get an idea about, oh my goodness, the animal's going back and forth through a prey patch at the same depth. And then you see the animal starts to kick as it goes back up to the surface. And it gives us just this very simplistic, but also very visceral understanding of how these whales use space, because you can see it if you see it in motion and relate to it, I think, a little bit better. And one of the things that this has allowed us to do is to look at individuality in whales. And in the upper left, you see these kind of spirals of bubbles. This is a very specific kind of feeding strategy that humpback whales do called bubble net feeding, where they go down below a patch of prey and blow a certain number of rings of bubbles around that prey patch to help consolidate it and move it towards the surface. And then the whale comes up in the middle of that and feeds. This is oftentimes a behavior that's done in groups where individuals have roles that are very well defined. And on the bottom panel on the left here, what you see are the feeding strategies of 7 different individual whales. So for example, 189B-04 comes in from the bottom right, and it does kind of 2 loops at the same depth and then comes up. The next one over looks like it does 1, 2, 3 spirals and comes to the surface. The next one over does 2 spirals before it comes to the surface. The one on the far right doesn't really look like it knows what it's doing. And that may be a young animal that's just kind of figuring things out and hasn't developed its own individual kind of trademark feeding style. But it allows us to see that all whales aren't the same and they do things individually, which is really a unique thing. Now, on the right, the thing I want you to look at is that bottom graph that has sort of 3 different bars on it. And what this is showing is we measured whether whales were left-handed or right-handed. And what's really interesting is that all vertebrates share the same commonality of having a right side bias for many of the repeated behaviors that you do, especially things like feeding. And what we found with whales was about 90% of the whales are right-handed. They blow bubbles to the right or they roll onto their right side when they feed. About 8 or 9% are left-handed. And then there's a little bit of ambiguity in a few animals. And these proportions or ratios are very similar to handedness in humans, where you have about 85 or 90% right-handed versus about 8 or 10% left-handed. So again, we're starting to see some commonalities in the things that whales do that help us relate to them as humans. Okay. Now, one of the things that we've tried to do working with a group like the World Wildlife Fund is to take the data and the information that we are gathering on whales in the Antarctic and in other parts of the planet and put it all together and try and tell a story about how this science can better inform management and policy at broad scales. And we recently did this study called the Protecting the Blue Corridors. You can go online and download the PDF. It's fantastic. It was a great effort that WWF led and a whole bunch of researchers from around the world. What we did is we basically went through and tried to come up with a number of key messages on why protecting whales has benefits for nature and people, like I just discussed, how blue corridors, which are the corridors that these whales use as they migrate from the areas that they feed to the areas that they breed in, and how those are critical ocean habitats for migratory marine species. Typically in conservation, we think about let's protect the areas where they feed and let's protect the nursery areas where they give birth. Those are critical areas, but there's all this space in between that is just as critical because that's exactly where the whales are. Wherever a whale is, it's critical to conserve and protect that. These migratory corridors are the things that have been sort of left out in the cold so far. As I mentioned, whales are an indicator of ocean health, but face a lot of growing threats. So being able to understand these and identify where the threats to these animals occur can make us a little more focused and capable of doing better conservation. And so what we do is we try and highlight a new conservation approach for enhanced cooperation, because these animals, as you'll see, migrate through the international waters as well as the national waters of a number of different countries. And if you have things set up in one country but not in another, as soon as those whales go into another country, those threats are going to be reestablished, and the conservation can effectively be for naught. So we wanted this to be a way to visualize where these animals go and the threats that they face, and how we can then focus our energies to being more vigilant. So this is the main graph that I want you to look at. What each of these lines are the tracks of whales where we've put satellite transmitters on the whales that actually show us the location of the animal over very long periods of time, months and months and months and months. The shading area basically shows you kind of where the corridors are over which all of the animals in the species migrate. And what's really amazing is that this is sort of a Southern Ocean dominated one because that's where a lot of the effort has been. But you can see that there's been a ton of work on the west coast of the US. You can also see where the lack of information is and the places that we need to be able to focus a little bit more attention on. Okay, one of the things that we did in this was to try and understand or showcase where different threats were for different animals at different times of the year in different places on the globe. Obviously, climate change is one that we need to be able to look at, and we have great data from that from a remote sensing perspective. Fisheries, obviously, is another huge one, and there are these great online data sets that can tell us about where fishing occurs and where the highest rates of activity are. And then things like shipping and vessel strikes are one of the main mortality factors for whales that migrate. And there's some great information out there on shipping and vessel traffic. So to be able to overlay these massive human threats with these corridors and the habitats that these whales use gives us a really nice visualization of the places where we need to focus our energies. So I want to just kind of end and show you guys a couple of examples of how we did this in this report. So what we're looking at here is the Eastern Pacific Ocean. You can see we're looking at both the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And what we have here are tags for both humpbacks and blue whales. The orange are humpback whales, the blue are blue whales, which is very nice for us to do. And what you can see at the very bottom part is the Antarctic Peninsula where we work. You can see the tracks of those animals going up and down the west coast of South America into Central America. And those animals cross the coastlines of Argentina, of Chile, of Peru, of Ecuador, of Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, 7 or 8 different countries that those animals are going very close to shore in their territorial waters. We can see that blue whales in those blue views up there, they use a slightly smaller area, but the density of those tracks is incredibly high. They're using almost all of the very coastal areas along the entire US West Coast and along the Mexican Baja California Peninsula and into the Sea of Cortez. And so with this knowledge, now we can look and see where are different industries hotspotting and how do they overlap with where these animals tend to be at different times of the year. This is one that's just sort of a look more specifically at Eastern North Pacific blue whales. And those top 2 panels that you see that are sort of the purple spectrums show ship traffic and the density of blue whale tracking data. And so we can do things now like literally put these on one another and look at them over discrete time periods like we have on the bottom, different times of the year. We need to be dynamic in understanding where the whales are and where human activities are, and look at these spatial temporal overlaps and be able to take this as evidence to these industries and use it as information and as a bargaining chip, basically, to show that there needs to be something to be done. The example that I want to kind of leave you guys with is this wonderful paper that we did that Ryan Reisinger, who was a postdoc in our lab, is now at the University of Southampton, led in Nature to show how tracking data in the Southern Ocean can be used to show the efficiency of conservation to date. So we use 17 different species, not just marine mammals, but birds, seabirds and penguins and pinnipeds, seals, sea lions and whales. We had over 4,000 individuals that were tracked. And what we did is we let the tracks tell us about where these animals go and where the important areas are for these animals, and see how well the existing marine protected areas cover those. And what's really interesting is if you look at and the background here, the highlighted yellow areas, or those places outlined in white, are the ecologically important areas for a number of species. The existing marine protected areas are highlighted in orange, and then new proposed ones are highlighted in pink. And what's incredible is that if you let the animals tell you about where is important, we find that current marine protected areas only cover about 1/4 of the ecologically important areas for those animals. And even all the proposed ones only bump that level up to about 40%. So it's very clear that the way that we are developing marine protected areas is much more based on human activities or human interests rather than what the animals are telling us are the important areas for them. So knowing how important these animals are for the marine ecosystem that they're part of, it seems to make sense that the animals should have a little bit more say in where the areas are that we should define as ecologically important that need to be protected and preserved. I think I'll end there. Hopefully that was easy enough to follow. I hope it.
Go for it.
I hate to steal a question, but I'm just dying to ask, has there been any movement on predictive modeling toward, it's so exactly what you're showing us with, the overlap of the ship traffic or the, the migration routes and thinking of that, has there been any forward motion on, stopping ship strikes then and looking at those patterns together and then doing something?
Yeah, there have been. And the ways that, again, sort of like that first example with the Dungeness fishery, it seems to work at relatively small scales. So for example, on the US East Coast with right whales, we know that their habitats have shifted in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy as their prey has shifted where it is going. And because of that, the Canadian government has actually moved physically the shipping lanes in those areas that did overlap or that do now overlap with the known distribution of those animals. Of course, those animals then go into the US and we don't do a damn thing about it. And so those same animals that Canada is doing a wonderful job of trying to remove the threat from are still at risk, in the US. One of the things that is being done in the US is sort of a dynamic strategy of having a network of hydrophones. And if animals are heard on any of those phones, that immediately sends out a communication to any ship in that area that then has to change its speed, not change its area, but change its speed to something that would produce a non-lethal strike if it actually happened. So it's happening in very small bits and pieces. On the West Coast here of the US, we know that there is a huge amount of overlap from ships going from San Francisco down to the Santa Barbara Channel. And blue whales are probably the most at risk in that respect. One of the things that's been proposed is that companies that are very coastal and have shipping lanes that are very coastal can only burn a certain type of fuel and has a higher, basically a higher floor for emissions. So you have to burn a cleaner burning gas that's more expensive. And so one option is if you tell the shipping companies, if you just go a little bit offshore, you can burn a cheaper gas and it's going to be less of an economic burden for you, and you can still go and make a faster speed through there. The issue in that sense is then you're burning, dirtier fuel and you're producing something that has, sort of another negative impact. So I don't know that there's not a universal answer, but it certainly seems like for these places where animals go through multiple countries, there needs to be partnership and cooperation, and that Blue Corridors report puts forth a couple of ideas for that.
Right. Great. Well, I think if there's one more question from the student group here, we'd be happy to take that.
I got one actually.
Go for it.
You seem to like there seems to be a lot more technology at play. Like the drones seem very recent, and then the buoy. Like, would this been possible like until recently? Like, what factor has been the technology to get all this data basically?
Yeah. These tags have been around for 15, 20 years, you know. The satellite tags have been around for longer, but these suction cup tags have been around for not very long. The technology certainly drives our ability to learn more about these animals, but we're still kind of logistically constrained. You still got to get in a boat, you still got to go out there and put a tag on a whole lot of whales, and that's going to take a lot of time to do. But fortunately, you know, I'm becoming a dinosaur. My students now are the ones that are going out and, you know, it's like that old, maybe at least Jason will remember that commercial about like a hair product, I think, where it's like you tell one friend, they tell one friend, and you know, you see the number of people that are then informed increase very quickly. And my hope is that the generation that has been blessed with the ability to sort of develop this technology, we have this F1 generation that is going to be much bigger than us, that has a greater sort of capacity to go out there and do this. But it still takes time. And these animals live lifetimes like we do. And so in some ways you can't speed up you know, how you learn about the biology of a long-lived animal in some ways. And so that will put a little bit of a governor on the speed that we can do things.